Okay, welcome back to the afternoon drive for Thursday, July 16th, Gateway X. Had a little bit delay there as traffic was heavy on the roundabout on the M3, but it's cleared up now. Our next clinic, which will run us into the round table at 5 Eastern Time, is Drake Hokanson is going to give us a chat presentation. Drake is an author, photographer, and lapsed university professor. His model railroad interests include realistic structures, signage, passenger and freight operations, especially the creation of effective visual and written model railroad paperwork from system maps to timetables to crew instructions. He is a tireless fan of the Denver and Salt Lake Railroad, and he's going to tell us how we can improve realism on our model railroads by using graphics. So take it away, Drake.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all. Hope everybody's enjoying the day here. I wish we were all together in St. Louis, but that can't be this year. Look forward to next year and seeing people in person and sharing that cold beer with everybody at some point. This is an area that I think is quite a bit of fun. I've enjoyed graphics for a long time. I taught photography and a little bit of graphic design at the university level for a long time, and I think it's one of those things that adds an enormous amount of realism to model railroads. We'll get into it here in a minute, but let me show you a couple things. I think one of the things that's neat about model railroading is that we get to create our own little worlds, and everybody is sort of fascinated by this. Anybody who has a layout and brings the neighbor kids in to see the railroad, the first thing they're amazed by is the sense of how you've created a realistic piece of the world in your own basement or attic. And I think it's a very creative endeavor, and the sense of miniaturization is something that we enjoy a great deal. So we love to create these miniature worlds in a sense from nothingness. It's a wonderful activity. And my argument is that our graphic design can make a real difference in this. Now I'm just showing you some kind of scenery photographs of things to kind of put us in the mood here a little bit, but we'll get into some specifics in a minute. This happens to be on some scenery I did on a friend's railroad here near La Crosse, Wisconsin. I work a lot with the River Rail group, which is based in La Crosse, Wisconsin. A group of about, I think there are 10 or 12 railroads now, focused on largely on prototypic operations, but also I like to do some scenery work. So here's a couple points to think about. That simple, good graphics really enhances realism by creating a deeper sense of place and a sense of time. I've been on a lot of model railroads just as a visitor. When I look around and I can kind of tell what era it is because there's steam and not diesel, or the other way around, or I can kind of tell by the shape of the mountains that it might be Colorado or it could be California, but we're not really sure. What era it is, what place it is sometimes difficult to tell. And I think we create a deeper sense of realism, a more interesting sense of a created world when we pay attention to more concretely to a sense of place and a sense of time. A railroad set in New Jersey in the 1950s should, of course, look and feel a lot different than a railroad set in Colorado in 1900. It should be a very different experience. But of course, you already knew that. We've been doing this for years. As we know, there are a lot of prototype modelers out there who are fanatics about not only every rivet, but also every passing siding in every industry, and model it right down to the very specific car numbers that went to a particular industry on a certain day. I'm not that guy, but I do think that what we do with our graphics in model railroading can pay big dividends in this. So this clinic is really kind of two clinics in one, and it's really an idea generator rather than a how-to. It's two clinics in that I'm going to talk a bit about signage, that is mostly scenery signs that we put on structures first, and then second I'm going to talk a little bit about layout diagrams and things that documents, diagrams, graphic things that you present to your operators so that they can better operate your railroad. But let's start with some scenery and some signs. So here's a situation for us. We're looking at a downtown building row in a central Illinois town, maybe circa about 1960. Some of us are old enough to remember that time. And maybe it's a county seat town of some size, maybe, I'm guessing, maybe 10,000 people. And of course, downtown, the buildings are largely brick, 2 or 3 stories, probably a bank on the corner, a dime store, a cafe, who knows? So my job was to create this town scene, one side of Main Street, if you will, that faces the tracks and ultimately the aisle on a friend's railroad, Ron Kofer, who's part of the River Railroad. So I started, as one would, with Google Earth and a handful of structure kits that he had, some part built, some simply in the box. And first place I went was Google Earth. What do Illinois towns look like in that era? Now, of course, I'm looking at Google Earth pictures, which are pretty contemporary, and we have to think a little bit about what they looked like prior to some of the modern fronts that get put on them and the paint jobs that they get. And when we, for instance, take out these upper windows and put in plywood, what did they look like maybe in 1960? This happens to be Vandalia, Illinois, and gives you a pretty good example of buildings that were probably built 1870s, 1880s. Now, these are fairly ornate and maybe unusually ornate. Here's another from Mount Vernon, Illinois. And again, you could do this kind of research in coastal New Jersey or the mountains of Oregon with Google Earth. I'm pretty much addicted to Google Earth and spent a lot of time just messing around on Google Earth to see what I can find, but it's also a fabulous research tool. So I looked at a lot of Google Earth images and street views and selected some structures from Ron's collection and got to work, especially during COVID times. I had a little more time on my hands and got to work. So I started with a bank building on the corner. Most any of these towns would have a nice bank building, as I think this building was in Mount Vernon, Illinois. And a kit that I chose for this, and this is one that I bought, is Walther's, I think it's Argosy Bookstore, which clearly was built as a bank building. This is, I think, where Walther's company originally started, if I'm not mistaken. Some of our viewers might know. And this is a really neat kit. It's very well done. Certainly plenty of neat ways to put it together. It's a good enough kit that I pretty much used it stock, except for some graphic details. So let me walk you through a little bit of what I did. Okay, we're talking central Illinois here. And I happened to start Googling old bank signs or bank clocks. And this one turned up. I think it was sold on some auction site, not eBay, but maybe some fancy auction site. And I thought, oh, this is a nice sign. This is one of those signs that projected out from the building and had a clock, which they all had for many years. And Prairie City Bank. I don't know if it's Prairie City, Indiana or Iowa or where it originally was. But I found online in my research, again, just Googling for images, found this sign and found a pretty high resolution copy of this sign or image of this sign. And I thought, well, I can work with that. But the town isn't Prairie City. It's actually called Domain. But how about Prairie State Bank? Illinois is, after all, Prairie State. Why not the Prairie State Bank? That gives a kind of sense of place that I liked and Ron liked as well. So I took borrowed the photograph, and I straightened it up in Adobe Photoshop. I think most people are probably familiar with how you can do that. Cropped it, straightened it up, squared it up, and then simply used the rubber stamp tool to erase the printing, erase the name. And I had a nice palette to work with. As you could say, I also cleaned up some of the old, I don't know if they're bullet holes or maybe holes for, maybe there was some neon involved here at one time, but at any rate, I cleaned a lot of that up as well. So I wound up with a pretty decent sign to work with. And then I'm using then Adobe Illustrator, which is a very powerful graphic design program. not the cheapest in the world, but I think you can do these kinds of things with most any of the graphic design programs that are out there. Many of them are free. A lot of computer software comes with some. I think Apple has one that's built into a lot of their computers. It simply takes some experimentation to figure out what software you can use to design signs. Photoshop works up to a point, but really if you're starting to mess around with type, get out of Photoshop and into something that works a little better, some sort of simple graphic design program. So then I put my type in, Prairie State Bank. I liked a little brighter yellow than was on the original sign. And I also used Photoshop, and you can see I flipped the sign over, and I had to then retype the text so it wouldn't be backwards. And then if you'll notice, I took, you'll notice that what happens when you flip the sign is the clock now reads wrong. And I wanted the clock to read correctly on both sides. So I printed 4 of them, and I cut the clock out of 2 of them and glued it onto the sign such that the clock says the same thing on both sides of the sign. And the clock also has a little third dimension. Not difficult. Took me about an hour. Also figuring, well, okay, we need some window covering here. And again, in Adobe Illustrator, I messed around and measured the windows and came up with some window designs that I liked pretty well. And I tried a couple different things and liked the one on the right a little bit better. So here's what the building looked like with the signs built. Here's the clock, and 2 layers of the sign over a piece of styrene in the middle, and a shaft that goes in and a support. And then the windows in the bank with some sort of Venetian blinds and some of these old leaded windows across the top. I was pleased with it. I thought it worked pretty well, given how little investment I actually had in terms of time and money. So it's a bank building. Well, I thought a little bit about what a corner bank might also have in a county seat town in central Illinois in 1960, and I thought, why not a radio station? And the 3rd floors of a lot of these buildings often had chiropractic offices or the doctor and dentist or a legal office or what have you. And I thought, well, a radio station would be kind of nice. So I created a radio station. There's actually a WRJC. I think it's in Marinette, Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken. But I named it such because W is the FCC indicator in general for any radio station east of the Mississippi. And RJC are the initials of Ron James Kofer, the owner of the railroad. And I just randomly picked 1440 as the AM frequency. And I thought another way to reinforce the idea of this being the place is to do this with the name of the town. It just kind of reinforces where you are. And thus was born WRJC and the sign on top. The sign, I'm sure many of you have seen these and even used them, was done with these Slatters fine scale railway component letters. I have bought over the years a bunch of them in different sizes. These happen to be 6 millimeter high, and I find them very useful for doing this kind of sign. And it adds a nice touch, a little bit more interesting looking building than you might find otherwise. Just a little more attention to some detail gives it a sense of time and place that you might not otherwise get. So a word about research. I just have a lot of fun with this. I knew the domain needed to have a cafe, and with Ron's permission, I named it after my mother. I named it Mona's Cafe, and my mother liked blue. And so I thought, well, this cafe really ought to have some blue curtains in it. And if you Google blue curtains or use any of the other search engines, you'll find 1,000 different opportunities. And it's a pretty easy thing to pick ones that seem like they'll work well, and then simply print them onto paper, cut them out, and put them in the window of your cafe. And a word about printing, I'm using just an ordinary inkjet printer. I happen to have an old printer. I can't even tell you what brand it is. And I choose my paper pretty well. It's generally acid-free paper, but these are just little ditties that I find on the internet. Breakfast special, $2.99. Cut out the open sign, etc., and put in the windows for detail. So it adds a lot. It takes very little time, and a decent printer and a sharp X-Acto knife, and you can do a lot. Also, regarding research, something else I found useful is Logopedia. I've run across this 2 or 3 times. For a dime store I was building, a drugstore, I wanted to find the old logo for Hallmark cards, and it took me to Logopedia, where I could find a very high quality, I think it was a JPEG or PDF of the Hallmark logo that I could use for a building. This will be very helpful if you're looking for old logos of old businesses. Again, in research, don't forget such things as old matchbook covers. It happens that I have a box of these that I've just accumulated over the years from different sources, and with any kind of good scanner or even a digital camera, you can make images from these and use them to make some really pretty innovative signs. Things that aren't commonly seen in the average model railroad. Give you a very specific sense of place. So, for instance, too, in terms of research, if you're going to build a Texaco station, even a nice kit that's a Texaco station, you could do yourself a lot of good by simply Googling old Texaco station and see what turns up. In this case, under the image file, I think this was with DuckDuckGo, if I remember, there were hundreds of photographs of Texaco stations of all different kinds of eras, which gave me all kinds of ideas for details, and added a great deal of enjoyment to me, to my model railroading hobby, but then also helped me find some signage that worked out very well for a little roadside Texaco station that I did out in the country on Ron's layout as well, including some of these signs. Some of these came with the kit, but many I just found on the internet. So a little research is not only enjoyable, but it leads to a kind of realism of time and place that you really can't get any place else. This Texaco filling station sign, for instance, is of a certain era. Later they simplified them, but about 1960 on this particular railroad, that's what you'd probably see, especially in the countryside. Now, over the time, I have collected hundreds and hundreds of these things, everything from feed to soda fountain signs to Odd Fellows. I've got build a building that had an Odd Fellows meeting hall in the upper floor, and I just find this stuff. I get bored in an evening, and I really got a half an hour before I want to go to bed. I'll just go looking for something and turn it up and borrow an image from the internet. I don't make any money off of these. They're for private use only, so I really don't see any copyright issues at all. So here's another case. This was kind of fun. Same railroad. This happens to be Ron Kofer's Lake Erie and Southern Railroad. It's a small Indiana tire store, circa 1960, in a small city down by the tracks, kind of a maybe the wrong side of the tracks part of town. So here's another way you do research. You see stuff in your own town. I used to drive by this Goodyear dealer twice a day on my way to and from work, and I would see this nice banner. It's actually a 3-dimensional banner on the side of the Goodyear service center. And one really cold January day, I took my telephoto lens and took a few photographs. You can see there's snow up here, and it was really pretty cold. But I tried to get as square on as I could. But I also knew that I could square it up once I got into Photoshop. And that's exactly what I did. I cropped it, squared it up, cropped it, and also got rid of a electrical box here and something else there. But I kept some of the details because that adds just a little something to it. At the same time I made that photograph on the side of that tire dealer, there was this sign: "We service most extended warranty contracts, free alignment check." And I drove by the sign again twice a day, and I thought, now what could I do with that? So I took a good photograph of it, and again squared it up and Um, Looked at it and thought, okay, what letters do I have here that I can work with? In 1960, the idea of extended warranty contracts was not there. Nobody understood anything about extended warranty contracts. So what could I replace that with? We service most something or other, and then free alignment check. One of the things I liked was the letters are kind of crooked and they're kind of crammed together. So I thought, well, if I get rid of this extended warranty contracts, what could I put in there instead? So I kind of kept track of the letters I had, and ultimately I used layers in Photoshop and just simply copied letters. Well, first thing I did is I erased all the middle stuff using the clone stamp, and you didn't have to be too careful with it. I wanted to get these lines accurately lined up, but the sign's going to be pretty small. So I erased all those using the clone stamp. And then let's see, what letters do I have? What could I say and what would be appropriate for the time? Well, how about we service most foreign cars? 1960, people were getting Volkswagens, and could they work on them? Maybe, maybe not. You can see also I brightened it up a little bit and sharpened it just a little. So how long did this take me? Well, I don't know, maybe an hour for this little sign. But frankly, I think it was worth it. Here's the building. It's right on the side here. I'm not sure if this is a Walter's grocery store or something, but I cut a garage door into it and found one of these old service signs, made some signs for it, made this sign, and then kind of plywooded in the front entryway. And since this photo was taken, I put in some tire sale signs, and it makes a pretty convincing structure that's different than you're going to see on most railroads. So that was a fun project. People have commented on that. Even a couple people have recognized this movable letter sign. So then most recently, same town, Domain, Illinois, as I mentioned earlier, we needed, in this county seat town, we really ought to have a variety store, a dime store, a 5 and dime store. These were ubiquitous in the middle of the country for many, many years. So I thought, well, okay, let me just do a little research. And so I started with Woolworths. And despite my image search, I could never find a very good photograph that showed the FW Woolworths sign. I think somebody makes one commercially, but part of the challenge here is to see what I can do on my own. Most of them I could find were either there was something blocking them or they weren't very high resolution, as this one wasn't. So I thought, well, okay, maybe not Woolworths. How about the big competitor, Ben Franklin? And I discovered this photograph. It was in a blog, somebody who traveled Iowa's 99 counties and had uploaded a very nice high resolution image of the Ben Franklin store in Sheraton, Iowa. Now, I don't know if the Ben Franklin is still there or not. The blog is a little old, but this then proved to be a treasure chest. Not only did it have the Ben Franklin sign, it had a lot of other details that I could use very nicely. So I squared it up in Photoshop and then started extracting some things, including these signs in the window. Those could fit in 1960. Summer sale, that's fine. And of course, I extracted the Ben Franklin sign. That was easy enough. Also, stuff in the window. If I'm going to build a building that has this much glass, I'm going to have something in the interior rather than just a dark hole. So I copied a bunch of stuff and I started messing around in Photoshop. Here's the basic sign. And I borrowed a number of things from some photographs I had of dime store windows that I'd collected, and I just began pasting things together to get some kind of pastiche of what might be in a dime store window. It doesn't have to be highly detailed. It just has to kind of look about right. So then this, I wound up building in here. Now there's a little reflection on the glass, so it's kind of doesn't look as good as it actually is. So this is I cut the front out of the structure, and I don't know if it's design preservation structure or just whose structure it is. And based on a Lance Mindheim article in Model Railroader, used evergreen strip styrene and built the doors and the windows. And then on my printer, I printed out this background, this interior, and these signs. We can even rent a Hoover carpet cleaner at this Ben Franklin. I especially like the giant panda in the window. I think that's a nice touch. So this is what the entire storefront looks like. We'll talk about curtains in a couple minutes, but that's kind of a nice detail. So here's another building in the same area. Again, a kit that Ron handed me partially assembled. And this is an older building. It's 3 stories. It looks like it probably built in the 1870s, kind of simple cornice work. The floors, each floor is a little short. So this would be about right for Central Illinois in the 1870s, one of those early buildings that never burned. And it sits on the end of this main street, so you can see this end quite prominently. And I thought, well, let's give this building a story. It's now the newspaper office downstairs and some other offices up here, a dental office and a lawyer's office. A commercial decal provided the old Lincoln Hotel sign, the old ghost sign. This is the land of Lincoln, after all. It's Illinois. Why not have this be the former Lincoln Hotel? It provides a nice little story to this place. It adds interest. It adds realism to the time and the place. Upstairs, I honored a friend of mine, a model railroader friend, who's a retired dentist, Ray Bauschlicker, and the Leonard Law Office on the 2nd floor. This is simple. This was easy. They're Venetian blinds here. Your resolution may not show these very well, but on Adobe Illustrator, I just simply created Venetian blinds using rectangles and lines. It took me 10 minutes to do the first one, and then I just copied them. It was very simple. And then I put text on top of them, printed them, and you glue them into the windows. And you can't tell whether the lettering is on the window itself or on the Venetian blind. Simple stuff, and quite a bit of fun. So here are 9 of the 10 buildings that I am building for this Domain, Illinois, for Ron Kofer, River Rail. They're right now sitting on my bookcase. I've got one more that I'm working on now. And I've been waiting for COVID numbers to kind of taper off here a little bit, and then I'm going to go out to Ron's and install them. But they're kind of fun to have on my bookcase at home right now. This is the newspaper office we talked about. This is the dime store, Mona's Cafe, and a hotel with a Oddfellows meeting hall on the top, a grocery store, the bank and radio station, a hardware store, and a bar in an old wooden building. The bar is called the River King Tap, named after one of the passenger trains on Ron's Railroad, and Dan Munson Feed, Seed, and Fertilizer, named after Dan Munson, who's a friend and also presenting at this conference. So those will get installed maybe next year. I'll show some pictures of these in a clinic. So I'm moving along fairly quickly because I want there to be time for questions and for everybody to be able to take a break. And we got started a little bit late. Back to the beginning point, and that is that simple, good graphics enhance realism by creating a deeper sense of place and a sense of time. I want to talk here a little bit about the graphic publications, the graphic pieces that you do for your operators, the people who come and operate your railroad. They also convey important information for operators. And I'm talking here about everything from timetables to layout diagrams of various kinds that you'll see in a minute. And we'll start with the caboose card, which I think is an often overlooked piece. Whether you're really interested in operations or just merely want people to come to your railroad and run trains in a coherent manner so they know where they are and where they're going, a caboose card can be a very useful thing. And I call it a caboose card because it's a card that, for some model railroads, it goes into the packet of waybills or a timetable or something, such that it's near the back end of the packet of cards, such that you can just flip that packet over and you have a little diagram of the railroad. And these things are kind of, well, almost thumbnail sized. You know, they might be quarter sheet or smaller. They fit into your hand very nicely. And depending on the railroad and the way the railroad is set up, I make them to fit. They should be simple. But if you're like me, you've had that experience where you've gone to somebody's wonderful model railroad and they say, okay, um, you're in Gunn right now and you need to go to Cloquet. And you think, okay, which way is that? Where am I now? And if you've got this little caboose card in the back of your packet, you know what direction is what. Here's west, here's east. Cloquet is going to be east. All right, now I kind of basically know what's going on. I'm going to go through Floodwood before I get there. This is on Ed Klein's Great Northern Mesabi Division Railroad, part of River Rail, a really terrific railroad. So these are very handy. These are just a little thumbnail to give you the most basic information about how the railroad is arranged. Here's another one I did for a Michigan Central Railroad that's set in World War II. And again, the same idea. What direction is what? Here's where the helix is. Where are the junctions? Notice in this card, I used an older typeface. It's a serif typeface. It's an older fashioned typeface because this railroad is set in 1944, whereas the Great Northern is set about 1970, when we would have mostly been using sans serif bold faces to indicate it's a style consideration. It adds a sense of time. This typeface would not look right in a railroad set in 1880, for instance. These are more modern typefaces. So it's worth paying attention to those. Again, Michigan Central Railroad. Similarly, system maps. Neil Rogansack, part of the River Rail Group, owns the Montana Northland, a fictitious railroad that's a connector railroad across Idaho. And it's a really wonderful railroad, and he really wanted a system map. He'd worked out quite thoroughly where this railroad was and what it connected to. And I said, well, I'll try a system map. And it measures 11 by 17. And again, I did it on Illustrator. And it probably took me, I'm going to guess, 3 hours to do it. Here's a detail. And so we have these posted around the layout room in multiple places. There's one right above the dispatcher's desk. There's one right above the yardmaster's operation area. So that the yardmaster at River Bend has a car that needs to go to Spokane, he or she knows that it needs to go railroad east. And if you've got cars that go to Portland, well, those go railroad west. It's a handy thing to have. Important in doing these kinds of diagrams, these system maps, as I call them, is to make them such that you can tell what the modeled portions are. Modeled portions are shown in red. So we know that we actually have trackage that represents these places. These black tracks, those are off the railroad. Those are in staging. That really helps operators a great deal understand how the railroad works and what's there and what's not there. And to the extent I could, I kind of modeled them after the system maps that you find in the official guide to the railways at different times. Kind of made them look railroady to the extent that I could. That was part of the fun challenge. Again, I think you could do this in any graphics program. I started by finding online a map that shows Idaho, and I traced it out, and I had to do some compression. But we wanted people to know where that railroad was. Here's what I did for Ron Cofer's Lake Erie and Southern. I did this one real early in my career as a model railroad graphic designer, I guess. And I think, believe it or not, I think I actually did this one in Microsoft Word. It was a little bit strange. It was a little bit like using the space shuttle to deliver pizzas. It really was not the right tool, but I was able to make it work. I think if I were to redo it, I'd redo it in Adobe Illustrator. But again, you want people to know where the railroad goes. And for Ron, the model portion of the railroad is that which is in Illinois. And here's a little bit of a close-up of it. The resolution's not terrific, but again, this helps a great deal for people who are first-timers to the railroad. But it's not enough. It's really not enough. You kind of have to know where you are. And this is what I call an operator handout for the Lake Erie and Southern. And it's a half sheet of paper. folded the long way, and it sticks into a timetable. Well, I'm not going to talk about timetables in this session, but we could sometime. And it merely is designed to give a new operator the kind of knowledge that an experienced train crew would have with the railroad. It's to replicate the knowledge of having worked on the railroad for any number of months or years. So that person, that engineer, would know that Nathanburg is here and that Mayfield is to the east. That person would know that the Alton local runs between Alton and Chartel, and would know that there's trackage rights at the New York Central on this line. The idea is to keep this simple. Here's something I could hand an operator who hasn't run on the railroad, and he or she would know the basics of where the line goes. Notice too, I've indicated what's the lower deck and what's the upper deck. Now I know these are sort of reversed. You might think that the lower deck should be down here, but I made it map correct. Peoria is north of St. Louis, and if you remember this previous image, here's Peoria, here's St. Louis, and here's this fictitious South Anderson. And I wanted it to replicate that such that it made sense in a map sense, never mind which deck was which. So this I find very helpful. Ron hands these out to any new operator or anybody who comes just to explore the railroad so they know where they are. Now this is part of it. This gives you enough information to understand the width and breadth of the railroad. But if you were sent out on the Nathanburg local from Nathanburg to Pekin and Farmington, you really wouldn't have any idea how to operate or how to switch those industries. So then you need another kind of thing. I'm going to skip over that real quick. You'd need what I call a fascia diagram. You'd need a diagram, in this case, a Pine Cabin, which is on Neal's railroad, the Montana Northland. You're at Pine Cabin, according to this line diagram at the bottom, and then this is what you'll see at Pine Cabin. These are the tracks. Here's where you switch your cars. Here's where things get arranged. Here's the industry name, Protochem, Pine Cabin paper, complex switching tasks. But with this diagram adhered to the fascia of the railroad, you basically have all the information you need to complete your job. If your waybill says cars such and such go to the cleanout track, you know right where that is. You also know that if your next work is in Winger, what direction you need to go. So these fascia diagrams are, I think, very, very important. Let me back up just a minute. I forgot I was going to make a comparison. This is the operator handout for Lake Erie and Southern. This is the first one I did, and I realized it wasn't very successful. Too much detail. It was hard to read. This worked a lot better. This just seemed simpler, get you to the information promptly and more easily. So these fascia diagrams, I've done them for a lot of different railroads, and different operators, different layout owners have different ideas about what they want. Some want color coding up here that matches the color coding on their waybills. I think it's important to always have direction indicated, east, west, especially on railroads where east and west change, as some of them do, depending on where you are on the railroad. You go through a return loop of some kind on the railroad, and suddenly west is in the other direction. So you need to make things very clear so that operators know where they are and where they're going. It increases the fun of it, and again creates a sense of place that's very, very specific. Here's one that I did for a now defunct River Rail Railroad, and it had the basic line diagram at the bottom. Right now we're at Clyde, and here's all of the industries at Clyde that you might switch. And we wanted to make this very bold because of the nature of this railroad. This railroad the directions did flip as you followed this railroad through. Sometimes west was to the left and sometimes it was to the right, and you had to keep track. And so we decided to make this very bold. It's also true this was a north-south railroad geographically, but timetable west equaled north direction. So it was a little bit confusing, and you had to know where you were with all of that. What are we doing for time here? I think pretty good. I moved through things kind of quickly, I think, here, but I think there's two possible clinics that could come out of this. One that would get into more detail on the industry signs, but then a deeper, longer, wider, more thorough clinic on doing signage for fascia and timetables and that sort of thing. And at some point, if people express some interest, I might pull together a clinic on each of those. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to everybody today. My email address is up on the screen. If anybody wants to just email me directly for questions or what have you, I'm going to be out of town for the next couple of days, and my university decided to wreck all the emeritus professors' emails today, so I'm not getting any email right now. But in a couple of days, I should be able to answer people. But again, thank you. It's been my pleasure, and I hope to see you all in person one of these days soon.
Okay, thanks very much, Drake. Interesting presentation. Certainly learned a lot about what you can do to add to your layout to get the time correct. I've got a couple questions. One, do you know if there's a U.S. distributor for the Slater's Plasticard letters?
Good question. I think I ordered them out of the UK. They might. It's probably been 5 or more years ago that I bought them, and I think I did order them out of the UK. But Amazon anymore just seems to have about everything.
Yeah,
you might try there.
I know you can order direct from Slater's website, so that might be another option.
Yeah, pull together an order with a bunch of friends and get a bunch, save postage that way.
Yeah. Other question is, a couple people asked, how do you square up images in Photoshop?
Well, and that would be the subject of the how-to clinic that I could do sometime. I think even Photoshop Elements, as you go to the crop tools, at the top there'll be a checkbox that says perspective. I think perspective control or perspective. And if you check that box, you can take the corner sliders, corner pins or whatever you call them, the squares, and move them around to square up anything that's trapezoidal. And you hit the crop button and boom, suddenly it's just as square as a new brick wall. Photoshop, as you crop, go to perspective. Up at the top of the screen, there'll be a little click box for perspective, and you can square up some really pretty crooked stuff. It's really quite remarkable how well it works. I lost Bruce's audio there. I can't hear him.
Sorry.
That's
okay.
Okay.
On mute for a minute. How did you research the price of gas for the Texaco station in your time era?
Well, I worked at a Texaco station about a little later than 1960, and I remember selling gas for 23 cents for regular and 28 for ethyl, if I recall correctly. So that price actually is a little bit high, but it's out in the country, and those little gas stations out in the country, I was charging more for gas. So I thought it was close enough. And besides, that's the only super cheap price sign like that I could find. Now, again, you try 2 months later, you find entirely different things. So grab them while you can.
Right. Okay. That's all the questions. You have anything, Gordy?
Just to say, Pam hopefully is going to post the link in the chat to the Slater's website. It's actually Slater's Plasticard. If you go Googling Slater's UK, it's a tailor's. So you might not get the lettering that you want in, but you can get a decent kilt. But we'll be right back shortly with the roundtable. Today our topic is painting and weathering. Thanks, Drake. Gert will be in touch, or you get in touch with Gert, and he'll organise some more clinics at speed at the bottom of the helix. And we'll be right back. Hopefully.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you doing it.